The wind drifted gently across the Yorkshire countryside that morning, brushing frost over the hedgerows and dusting the window panes of Richard Bennett's home like icing sugar. Inside the modest stone cottage, silence hung heavy, interrupted only by the slow hum of a kettle and the creak of aging floorboards beneath his slippers. The old man moved through the rooms with the quiet precision of someone who had lived alone for a very long time. Every item he touched, a mug with a chipped lip, a cracked ceramic bowl, an ancient radio that hadn't worked in years, carried the weight of memory. Richard was 68 years old. His hair fully surrendered to gray and his eyes faded to a color between tired blue and storm cloud. He had been a librarian for nearly 40 years, a man whose life had been defined by order, by stillness, and by the safe weight of paper and ink. But on Christmas morning, as light filtered through drawn curtains and the distant sound of children's laughter echoed from the nearby cottages, he felt untethered, like a man misplaced in time. He had set a single place at the small kitchen table, a roast chicken far too large for one person, boiled potatoes, 2 parsnips, and a store-bought cranberry sauce he didn't particularly like. The dining chair across from his own sat empty, as it had for over a decade. He tried not to look at it too long. Before sitting, Richard retrieved his phone from the windowsill. A faint hope stirred as he checked it. One message. He opened it slowly, as if bracing for its weight. It read, "Don't expect me. Amelia." He stared at the screen until it dimmed and went black. His thumb hovered, but there was nothing left to reply. No argument, no insistence, no quiet plea. He simply placed the phone back on the sill, turned to the kettle, and made a cup of tea. As he stirred, a soundless smile crept across his face. It was not joy, not exactly. It was closer to resolve, that quiet, inward breath that precedes change. He poured himself a generous glass of red wine instead of tea and took a long sip before stepping into the narrow hallway. The attic hatch above him stared down like an eye half closed in sleep. He fetched the old stepladder from the shed and climbed slowly, each rung a creak, each movement deliberate. The attic hadn't been opened in years, not since Margaret had passed, and certainly not since Amelia had stopped coming home. A single bare bulb flickered into life as he pulled the cord, revealing a world held in dust and boxes. The air was stale with insulation and memory. He moved carefully, setting aside faded ornaments and stacked cartons marked in Margaret's cursive, "Books, Christmas, Amelia, primary school." He paused at a faded blue box. Inside lay a row of glittering paper stars, handmade with shaky hands and glue-streaked fingers. Amelia's handwriting, from when she was perhaps 8 years old, was scrawled on each. "To Dad. Best Dad. From your Christmas elf." Richard touched them gently, then set them aside. He pulled a larger box toward him, dragging it to the edge of the hatch. The box was full of framed photographs, stiff tuxedos and bright holiday jumpers, Amelia with missing teeth and oversized glasses, Margaret with her arm around them both. He did not cry. Instead, he descended the ladder slowly and began arranging boxes by the front door. By early afternoon, the living room looked half dismantled. The tree lights were off. The presents under it were untouched. He took down picture frames and dusted off corners, stacking memories into quiet little piles. The wine had settled warmly in his chest, and the stillness of the room no longer felt as cold. He found an old suitcase in the closet and set it on the bed. It still smelled faintly of mothballs and sea air. One by one, he began packing, not in urgency, but with a strange calm. Clothes, a shaving kit, a leather-bound notebook he'd once received from a former colleague who'd written on the inside cover, "You still have stories left." Night fell without announcement, and the street outside dimmed to a golden glow beneath the lamps. Laughter came again. Families celebrating. Carols drifting faintly through the walls. Richard sat alone in the kitchen and raised a glass to no one. The phone sat dormant on the sill, screen still black. He sipped, then stood. In the attic, he'd found something he hadn't seen in decades. A wooden box with a snow globe inside, a tiny house with glittering snow and 2 figures arm in arm. It was the last Christmas gift Amelia had given him before she'd left for university. He remembered her smile when he opened it, how she'd insisted it reminded her of their home. He turned the globe in his hands now, watching the flecks of snow fall slowly over the frozen scene. Then, after a long pause, he placed it in a cardboard box marked donation. That night, before he went to bed, Richard opened his laptop, rarely used, and clicked slowly through a few property sites. He uploaded a single photograph of the cottage, its stone walls softened by ivy and time, then typed a short description. Finally, in the listing price box, he typed a figure, lower than it deserved. He paused once more, then clicked publish. Outside, the wind had calmed. Inside, a house once heavy with silence began to feel lighter. The following morning, Richard rose before dawn. The sky was still a dull navy when he stepped outside, breath curling in the frozen air. He wore his old overcoat, the one Margaret had given him one Christmas long ago, now worn thin at the elbows. The village was quiet. No church bells. No children running past. Just the sound of his own footsteps crunching over gravel. He unlocked the shed and wheeled out a dolly cart. One by one, he began loading boxes from the front room. Childhood toys, old gardening tools, a box of vinyl records, and a tarnished silver tea set that had belonged to Margaret's mother. He stacked them neatly in the boot of his hatchback. The act felt mechanical, like shelving books back in his librarian days. Only this time, the stories were real, and he was parted with all of them. By mid-morning, the living room was nearly bare. Just a single armchair remained, and a coffee table with rings from forgotten mugs. The tree stood still in the corner, lights off, as if embarrassed to be the last decoration left. Richard ignored it. He moved through the house with purpose, wiping down surfaces, boxing up items he had not touched in years. Every drawer open revealed something that no longer belonged to anyone. Around noon, a knock echoed from the front door. Richard opened it to find his neighbor, Harold, holding a small tin of biscuits and wearing a paper crown from a cracker. "Just thought I'd check in," Harold said, eyes scanning the empty hall behind Richard. "Looks like you're moving out?" Richard offered a tired smile. "Just clearing the decks. Bit of a strange day for it, isn't it? Christmas and all. I figured I'd make room for the new." Harold shifted on his feet. "Well, we're having a bit of ado next door. Mulled wine, bad carols, worse jokes. You're welcome if you want to join." Richard shook his head gently. "Thank you, Harold, but I think I'll pass." Harold nodded, understanding more than he let on. He handed over the tin. "Take these anyway. Ruth made too many." When Richard closed the door, he placed the tin on the counter and returned to packing. The sun was already dipping when he made his final trip to the car. This time, he carried a small wooden crate filled with framed photographs, the glass faces catching the dim light like blinking eyes. He placed them gently in the passenger seat and returned inside to sit in the armchair. He opened the tin and ate a single biscuit. It was almond, not his favorite. He washed it down with the last of the wine, the glass now chipped from years of use. Then, with no ceremony, he stood and approached the tree. The presents beneath it remained unopened. Most of them were for no one. One, however, was wrapped in pale blue paper with Amelia's name on the tag. He took it in his hands, turning it over slowly. It was a copy of a book she'd loved as a child, newly bound, with a handwritten note inside that read, "Thought might remind you of quieter days." He did not unwrap it. Instead, he placed it atop a box marked library donation and left it by the door. Midnight approached with no fanfare. The village outside had gone quiet again, the soft hush of fresh snow falling, just beginning to thicken the edges of the world. Richard lit a single candle and set on the mantel, then poured himself the last of the wine from the bottle. Standing in the center of the room, surrounded by silence and boxes, he raised a glass. "To absence," he said aloud. The candlelight flickered, as if answering him. He took a long sip, eyes landing on a stack of books yet to be sorted. From beneath the pile, something glinted, a snow globe, the one he had set aside the day before. He had forgotten to box it. He picked it up, holding it at arm's length. The house inside it looked so peaceful, encased in its glass world. Two figures on the porch, forever mid-laughter. He gave it one final shake, watching the snow swirl and settle. Then, without another thought, He opened the back door and stepped into the cold. The snow globe felt heavier than before. He walked slowly down the garden path to the stone wall at the edge of the property. With a strange kind of finality, he placed the globe on the wall and walked away, leaving it to the frost and the morning birds. Inside, he folded himself into the armchair, the candle still burning low. He did not sleep. The next morning, while most of the village remained indoors recovering from rich dinners and cheap wine, Richard drove to the nearest charity shop. The woman behind the counter, a cheerful volunteer in a knitted reindeer jumper, smiled as he wheeled in the first load. "Late spring cleaning?" she asked. "Something like that," he replied. Over the next 2 hours, he made 3 trips. On the last one, she offered him a receipt for tax purposes. "No need," he said. "Let someone else give them new stories." On the drive back, Richard didn't take the usual route. Instead, he drove aimlessly through back lanes and unfamiliar villages, as though the countryside might give him direction. Somewhere past Ripon, he pulled over near a frozen pond and sat for a long while with the engine off, listening to the creak of ice and the far-off call of birds. He reached into the glove compartment and pulled out the notebook. Flipping to a blank page, he wrote just one line. Leaving is easier when there's nowhere to return. That evening, back at the cottage, he made his final preparations. He had already contacted the estate agent. The listing would go live in the morning. The suitcase stood packed by the front door. He moved room to room, switching off lights for the last time. In the bedroom, he left the wardrobe open. In the kitchen, he removed the bulb above the sink. It always flickered, and he couldn't bear to pass that annoyance on to someone else. Just before midnight, he made himself a cup of tea and sat in the armchair once more. No decorations, no music, just the gentle whistle of wind against the window panes. When the clock struck midnight, Richard raised a cup toward the empty seat across from him. "To whatever comes next," he whispered. The house gave no reply. He drank slowly, then stood and carried the cup to the sink. With one last glance around, he turned off the lights and climbed the stairs to sleep for the final time in the home he had once thought he would die in. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft, steady, without urgency. And inside, the house waited in silence, ready for its own kind of forgetting. The train rocked gently as it pulled away from the station, carrying Richard eastward into the unknown. He sat by the window, his suitcase tucked tightly between his legs, his notebook resting on his lap. The countryside blurred past, frostbitten fields, stone walls, and distant cottages whose chimneys whispered smoke into the pale morning sky. He did not look back. The cottage, now empty, had already begun the slow process of detaching from his memory, like a story once memorized and now only half recalled. Across the aisle, a boy of about 8 sat beside his mother, playing with a small plastic dinosaur. The boy glanced at Richard a few times, curious but polite, and Richard managed a faint nod. His reflection in the train window caught his attention more than the boy did. The man looking back at him seemed worn, certainly older than he remembered, but not entirely broken. He traced the lines of his own face with his eyes, wondering what parts of himself were still real and what had become echoes of former roles: husband, father, librarian, neighbor. When the train reached Bath, Richard stepped onto the platform and was struck by the crisp air, heavier here with the scent of cold stone and chimney smoke. The city rose around him like something sculpted from another time, rows of Georgian terraces, narrow alleyways, and buildings the color of honey under the winter sun. He had never been to Bath before, but it felt like the kind of place where stories nested easily, where a man might walk unnoticed yet never feel entirely alone. He found a room above a bakery on a quiet side street, the kind of place where the walls sloped at odd angles and the bed sagged slightly in the middle. The owner, a cheerful woman named Miriam, explained that the flat was rarely used outside tourist season. "You'll be warm enough," she promised. "It gets noisy early with the ovens downstairs, but you get used to it." Richard paid for the first month in cash and unpacked slowly. The suitcase held only essentials: a few shirts, trousers, his shaving kit, and a notebook now growing thicker with fragments. The room had no television, no bookshelves, and nothing of him yet. It was exactly what he needed. In the following days, Richard settled into a rhythm. Mornings began early, awakened by the scent of bread rising in the ovens below. He found a cafe not far from the Abbey where he could sit unnoticed, sipping tea and watching the town awaken. People moved with purpose but without rush. Locals with shopping bags, tourists with maps, students hunched against the cold. He walked the city for hours each day, learning its streets not by name but by feel. He came across a shelter near the river, small, weathered, but clearly cared for. Something drew him in, not pity, not charity, but a simple recognition of disarray. The inside smelled of dust and damp wool. A notice board near the entrance asked for help. Sorting supplies, repairing broken furniture, preparing warm meals. He spoke to the manager, a man named Callum with tired eyes and a voice like gravel. "You any good with tools?" Callum asked, gesturing toward a stack of chairs in disrepair. "I used to be," Richard replied. "Or at least, I'm willing to try." That was enough. They shook hands without ceremony, and by afternoon, Richard was sanding down splintered wood, hammering in loose nails, tightening bolts. It was a kind of work that required attention but not emotion, a perfect balance for a man who needed to keep moving without thinking too much. Evenings were quiet. He ate simple meals, soup from the bakery, bread, tea, and wrote. The notebook filled with letters again, none of them addressed to anyone but Amelia. He didn't reread them. He didn't need to. The act of writing was enough. A few days into the new year, his phone rang. He stared at the screen, recognizing the number instantly. It had been months since Amelia had last called. He let it ring out. No voicemail was left. A second call came 2 hours later. Again, he ignored it. Late that night, he finally checked his voicemail, half expecting silence. "Dad," came her voice, tight and clipped. "I need something. A document. From when I was a child. I think it's in a blue folder. Top shelf of the study. Maybe, if you still have it." There was a pause. She almost said something more. Then, "That's all." Richard deleted the message without replying. He no longer had the folder. He had given away or thrown it out. It didn't matter which. What mattered was her voice, the strained effort behind the formality, the unspoken weight between syllables. But he did not call back. The next morning, while fixing the leg of a table at the shelter, he heard someone say, "It's nice when someone shows up just to help, not because they're trying to fix themselves." Richard didn't look up, but the words clung to him. In town, he became a quiet fixture. Locals began to nod when they passed him. At the bakery, Miriam started leaving out a fresh roll each morning by his door. Callum mentioned that fewer volunteers were consistent, and Richard's presence had become reliable. He did not correct the assumption that he would stay. One evening, while clearing tools into a cabinet, he found a postcard stuck beneath a drawer. It was decades old, faded and yellowed, depicting a seaside pier somewhere in Cornwall. On the back, in elegant cursive, someone had written, "Come back when you remember how to laugh." There was no name, no address, just those words. Richard placed it in his notebook. He began to notice that people at the shelter told stories freely, as if the act of being near him loosened something. A man named Jerry spoke of a childhood pet, as though he were 6 again. A woman named Margaret, not as Margaret, sang lullabies softly while folding donated clothes. None of them asked Richard about his past, and he offered nothing, but the stories stayed with him. He wrote them down at night, not as memoirs, but as seeds for something else. Fiction, half-truths, fragments, dreams woven into paragraphs. It surprised him how easily the words came. By the third week in Bath, he found himself lingering outside a small bookshop. Its windows were crowded with old volumes, and a handwritten sign read, "We take stories, not just cash." He went inside. The shopkeeper was a man about his age, wearing a scarf that seemed older than either of them. "Looking for anything in particular?" he asked. Richard hesitated, then replied, "Not yet." "Then you're in the right place." That evening, Richard began drafting a new kind of letter, not to Amelia, not to anyone specific, but to the idea of forgiveness itself. He didn't know yet what it would become, but for the first time in a long while, he didn't mind not knowing. The flat above the bakery no longer felt temporary. He still left his suitcase packed, but now it sat in the corner, quietly ignored. The bed above the bakery was not kind to his back. Richard woke every morning with the same dull stiffness along his spine, a reminder that comfort, like memory, was no longer guaranteed. Still, he endured it without complaint. The creaking mattress and narrow sheets had become part of his new ritual, as familiar now as the early clatter of baking trays below or the smell of burnt flour drifting up through the vents. He spent most of his days at the shelter, hammering, sanding, painting, and replacing things broken by time or use. Callum, the shelter manager, had stopped treating him like a visitor. Richard was assigned a key and trusted with opening duties twice a week. On those mornings, he would walk through the cold mist at dawn, key in hand, and switch on the lights to rooms still heavy with last night's silence. It was in those quiet moments, before the noise returned, that he felt most at ease. One morning in late January, a girl no older than 20 wandered in with her coat half-zipped and her eyes red from either sleep or tears. She hovered by the entrance, unsure if she belonged there. "You all right?" Richard asked, stepping out from the back room. "I'm not homeless," she said quickly. "I'm just looking for someone. I think he was here last week." Richard nodded, undeterred. "We get quite a few through. What's his name?" She hesitated. "I don't know his name. I only know he fixed my grandmother's old radio 2 towns over, and someone said he might volunteer here." Richard blinked. "I fixed a radio recently. A heavy old wooden thing with brass knobs." Her face lit up with something close to relief. "Yes, that's it." My Nan's voice came through it for the first time in years. She said she felt young again. "I came to thank you." Richard gave a half smile. "You're welcome. It was good craftsmanship, just needed patience." She stepped forward, extending a hand. "Ellie." "Richard." They shook hands briefly. She lingered, clearly not ready to leave. "Actually," she continued, "I help out at an antique shop in Bradford-on-Avon. We don't really sell much, but we got a backlog of restorations. My boss is looking for someone steady. He's not good with his hands anymore. Arthritis. I told him about you." Richard tilted his head. "That was quick." "I talk fast," she said, smiling. "He's willing to pay weekly. Just part-time. You interested?" He should have said no. That had been his instinct for a long time now. Resist anything that tied him to Play's schedule or expectation. But something in Ellie's tone, something matter-of-fact and unpolished, made him pause. "Can I meet him first?" he asked. Ellie grinned. "Thought you'd never ask." 2 days later, Richard stood in a shop that smelled of beeswax and forgotten time. It was narrow, cluttered, and beautiful in a way only places untouched by modern design could be. The owner, a wiry man named Theo, wore thick spectacles and coughed every third sentence, but his eyes were sharp and his handshake firm. "You know Wood?" Theo asked, pointing to a battered cabinet missing one leg. "I know Patience," Richard replied. "Same thing," Theo muttered. "Start with this. If it doesn't fall apart when you're done, I'll give you keys." The work was slower than at the shelter, but more rewarding. Richard spent hours in the back room of the shop, surrounded by chipped tables, rusted hinges, and stacks of old clock faces. Ellie checked in often, sometimes to bring him tea, sometimes just to talk. She had a disarming way of skipping past small talk. "Did you always work with your hands?" she asked one afternoon, watching him apply a fresh coat of varnish to a wardrobe door. "No, I used to work in silence," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "Library," he clarified, "for almost 40 years. And now you're fixing broken things." He didn't respond right away. Then, without looking up, he said, "Some things are easier to fix than others." Ellie didn't press him after that. Richard began splitting his time between the shelter and the shop. Mornings he'd still walk the river path to the shelter, but afternoons belonged to Theo's cluttered treasure cave. Theo paid him in cash, slid discreetly into an envelope on Fridays. Richard never opened them in front of him, and Theo never asked if he needed more. One evening, back in his room above the bakery, Richard received another voicemail. His phone buzzed once before falling still. He didn't rush to listen. It had become a quiet ritual. Wait, then decide. Later that night, after finishing a letter he didn't intend to send, He finally pressed play. "Hi, it's me again." Amelia's voice was less formal this time, less practiced. "I know I've been calling. I know you've been ignoring them. I'm not even sure why I keep trying. Maybe I just missed the sound of something familiar. Maybe I'm angry that you don't sound like anything anymore." A pause, breathing. Then, "The blue folder wasn't where I thought it would be. Not important now. Just, I don't know. I guess I thought you'd at least pretend to care." Click. Richard deleted the message, but not before he replayed it twice, memorizing the rhythm of her words. That night, he lay awake on the unfamiliar bed, listening to the quiet buzz of the bakery's refrigerator through the wall. The silence felt different now. Not cruel, just honest. He woke before sunrise and walked the city in the dark. He passed closed pubs, quiet storefronts, rows of identical windows. On a bench near the Abbey, he sat and watched the city blush with morning light. The notebook came out again. This time, instead of a letter, he wrote a line that surprised even him. "I don't want to forget her. I just want to stop bleeding every time I remember." He underlined it, then closed the book. That same day, Callum asked if Richard might consider helping with outreach on weekends, visiting people in temporary housing, bringing supplies, checking in. "You don't have to say yes," Callum said, "but they trust you. Sometimes that's all it takes." Richard considered it, then nodded. "All right." On Sunday morning, he knocked on the door of a quiet flat above a laundrette. An elderly woman answered, peered at him through smeared spectacles, and let him in without a word. Her heater wasn't working, and the windows stuck. He fixed both in under 20 minutes. "Why do you bother?" she asked, watching him fold away his tools. "Because it helps me forget why I stopped bothering for a while." She didn't reply, but offered him tea before he left. That night, he returned to the shop and found a parcel waiting on the work table. Inside was a stack of letters tied in string, none addressed. A note from Theo read, "Found these in a drawer. Thought you'd know what to do with them." Richard read the first. It was dated 1962. A woman writing to a brother she hadn't seen since the war. The language was formal, careful, but rich with yearning. He felt something stir in him. Not sorrow, not quite, but possibility. He copied the letter into his notebook. Then he wrote a fictional reply, one that never existed. It was the first time he wrote someone else's ending. Rain fell in slow, persistent sheets against the bakery windows, blurring the world outside into watercolor smudges. Richard sat at the small table by the window in his room, a cup of cooling tea beside him and the notebook open, its pages bent and swollen from use. A lamp cast a quiet yellow glow over the paper as he hovered his pen above a blank page, uncertain how to begin. He had filled the first notebook weeks ago, its spine now barely holding together. He'd moved on to a second, thicker one, and this page, halfway through, had remained untouched for 3 days. The words refused to come. It wasn't that he had nothing to say. If anything, there was too much. The shelter had grown busier as winter deepened. More people found their way through its doors, carrying hunger, illness, or simply exhaustion in their faces. At Theo's shop, the work had become more intricate. Antique clocks whose inner mechanisms demanded delicacy and care, roll-top desks with hidden compartments, and initials carved long ago. Evenings were now spent alternating between sanding wood and decoding half-legible love letters from decades past. But every time he tried to write something of his own, his thoughts scattered like spilled screws. On Thursday, Miriam brought him a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "Left for you downstairs. No name, no return address." He opened it with careful fingers. Inside was a paperback novel, secondhand, its cover faded, and a note tucked between pages 136 and 137. The note was typed, not handwritten. "I remember you used to read this to me. I forgot the ending until last week. I cried at this page. Thought you should know." There was no signature, but he knew the book. A children's fantasy about a girl who traveled through paintings and had to choose which world she'd stay in. He had read it to Amelia dozens of times, always pausing at the exact moment she'd whisper, "Wait, don't skip the part with the locket." He read page 137 in silence. It was a scene with a father figure, having waited by a lake for years. Finally realized the girl wasn't coming back. He carved her name into a tree, then disappeared. Richard set the book down and left it untouched for the rest of the week. That same evening at the shop, Ellie leaned against the counter while he worked on a grandfather clock that refused to chime. She watched him in silence before speaking. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked. "From here," he replied without looking up. "From everything. Bath, the job, the people who only know the version of you let them see." Richard tightened a bolt. "All the time." She nodded, as if confirming something for herself. "I'm thinking of going back to university. I deferred my place. Thought I wasn't ready. Still don't know if I am." He looked at her now. "Properly, what would you study?" "History," she said, "because it's safe to love dead things." He smiled, but not dismissively. "Maybe because they don't leave." Ellie's voice softened. "Some just stop calling." Neither of them spoke after that. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was earned. The next morning, Richard found himself at the river again. He sat on the same bench as before, the one that looked out across the wide water and toward the rising spires of the city. He opened his notebook and began writing letters again, but not the kind he had been writing before. These were shorter, more direct, almost surgical in tone. "Amelia, I don't know what your voice sounds like anymore when you're not angry. I wonder if you remember mine." Another, "You were 6 when I let you walk ahead of me for the first time. I told you to look both ways. You looked back to see if I was watching. I always was." Another, "I stopped being angry the moment you stopped calling me Dad. I just didn't know what else to do with the quiet after that." He paused. The last sentence lingered. He wrote again, slower this time, as if giving permission to remain. "I stopped being angry the moment you stopped calling me Dad." That night, he tucked the notebook into a drawer beneath his bed. It didn't need to be open again for a while. The following week, the shelter hosted a writing workshop. A local teacher named Janine had offered to run it for free, hoping to give the residents and volunteers alike a space to speak without speaking. Richard hadn't planned on attending, but Callum coaxed him with a well-placed comment. "You've been writing more than you've been talking lately. Might be time to switch that balance." He went, reluctantly. In the small common room, a dozen chairs formed a circle. People introduced themselves, some with real names, some with whatever they decided to be that day. Janine handed out notebooks and pens. "No pressure," she said. "Just write something you wish someone had said to you, or something you wish you had said back." Richard stared at the blank page for a while. Then he wrote, "I know that absence could echo louder than words. I wish I had told you that my silences weren't punishment. They were fear. When the time came to share, most people passed. Richard did too. But afterward, Janine pulled him aside. That line about fear, would you mind if I used it in a zine we're putting together? Anonymous, of course." He shrugged. "Words aren't mine once I let them out." "You're a writer," she said, almost as a statement. "I'm a man with too many unsent letters," he corrected. But he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years, the subtle ache of possibility. Later that week, he received a small envelope in the shop post. No name, just a single sheet of paper, folded twice. It read, "I don't know if I hate you or just miss who I thought you were. Either way, I'm sorry." He didn't need to guess the sender. He didn't tell anyone he received it. He folded it neatly and placed it inside the back cover of his notebook. Not as a keepsake, not as a trophy, just as a placeholder, a mark for where something had once broken and might one day begin again. Theo noticed his mood had changed. "You work quieter than usual. Is that a complaint?" "No. It means the work's doing what it's supposed to." "What's that?" "Keeping you close to something worth saving." Richard didn't reply. He didn't need to. That night, he walked the streets a little longer than usual before returning to his room. The rain had stopped, and the cobblestones glistened beneath the lamplight. He passed people laughing outside a pub, a couple arguing softly near a bus stop, a group of teenagers skateboarding where they shouldn't. The city felt alive in ways he hadn't allowed himself to be. Back in his room, he stood by the window, notebook unopened, tea untouched. He whispered the word "Dad" to himself just once, to hear how it sounded out loud. Then he turned off the light and let the unfamiliar bed take him, for once, without resistance. February arrived with a bitter wind that swept through the streets of Bath like a messenger from colder countries. Richard had taken to wearing a thick scarf and gloves even indoors at the shop, as the back room where he worked was only modestly heated. The shop's old radiator rattled as if protesting the season, and Theo had long given up trying to coax it into silence. Work remained steady. Richard had nearly finished restoring a rosewood vanity that arrived with cracked mirror and half its drawers jammed. As he adjusted one of the runners, the bell above the door rang, a high, metallic chime that always cut cleanly through the room's dust and quiet. He expected it to be Ellie or a courier. Instead, a voice called out, unfamiliar and clear, "Is there someone here who fixes things?" Richard stood slowly and stepped to the narrow hallway to the front of the shop. A young woman stood near the entrance, removing a woolen hat and shaking out dark, wind-swept hair. She looked to be in her early 20s, sharp-featured and visibly anxious, with one gloved hand clutching a small, square object wrapped in a tea towel. "I was told someone here repairs antique electronics," she said. "I do sometimes," Richard replied, brushing sawdust from his sleeves. "Depends on the damage." She stepped forward and carefully unwrapped the object. It was an old wooden transistor radio, its corners worn, one knob missing, and a long crack running down the left side. He recognized the model immediately, a Roberts R300 from the 1960s. A delicate machine with fragile wiring, but salvageable. "It was my grandmother's," the woman said. "She passed 2 weeks ago. I found it in her loft. It hasn't worked in years, but she used to say it played the clearest music she ever heard." Richard gently lifted the radio, turning it over in his hands. "You're Ellie's friend, aren't you?" The woman blinked. "Yes, Ellie's cousin, actually. My name's Isla. She mentioned someone might come by. This can be restored. Might take a few days." She nodded, clearly relieved. "Thank you. I didn't want it to end up in a skip." As she left, he noticed how she paused by the doorway, glancing at the walls lined with clocks and cabinets. "It smells like my Nan's kitchen in here," she said softly, "like old wood and polish." He smiled faintly. Then she had good taste. Back in the workshop, Richard set the radio aside and resumed sanding the vanity's legs. But Isla's voice stayed with him. Something about her manner, respectful, uncertain, yet deeply sincere, reminded him of how Amelia used to act when she was very young, particularly when she wanted something but didn't know how to ask for it. Later that afternoon, Ellie arrived, winded from the cold and her commute from the outskirts. "I see Isla made it," she said, tugging off her gloves. "She's got a soft spot for old things, but no idea how they work." Richard nodded. "She handled the radio like it was made of glass. She does that with everything. People, too." Ellie lingered longer than usual that day, pulling a chair beside him as he worked. She didn't speak for a while, instead watching him fix the stripped threads in the vanity's drawer. After some time, she said, "Have you ever thought about teaching?" Richard looked up. "Teaching? You've got the patience for it. There's a charity in Bristol starting a skills program for young offenders. Woodworking, repair, practical things. I mentioned you to someone." He frowned. "Why?" "Because you don't talk down to anyone. Because you don't expect people to be perfect before you give them your time." Richard thought about it for a moment. "You make me sound more generous than I am. I just see what most people miss." He didn't give her an answer, but he didn't dismiss the idea either. Over the next few days, Richard worked carefully on the radio. He rewired the internal amplifier, replaced a damaged knob with one salvaged from another broken unit, and glued the case with a mixture he always trusted more than store-bought adhesive. As he did, he found himself humming softly, a habit he hadn't noticed returning until it became familiar again. When Isla returned to collect it, her expression shifted visibly as she heard the gentle hum of static rise from the speakers. He adjusted the dial until a local classical station came through, warm and clear. "She'd have loved this," Isla whispered, cradling the radio like a child. She always said music sounded better when you had to wait for it. Richard nodded. There's something in that. Isla reached into her coat and handed him a photograph. It was her grandmother, seated beside the same radio, smiling as if mid-song. "Keep it," she said. You gave her voice back. After she left, Richard placed a photo on a shelf in the workshop. Not for sentimentality, but because the woman's eyes reminded him of something he didn't want to forget. That weekend, he took the train to Bristol and met with the program coordinator Ellie had mentioned. The man, a former carpenter named Marcus, greeted him with a handshake and a grin. "You're not what I expected," Marcus said. "Neither are you," Richard replied. They toured the workshop. Bare walls, a few scattered benches, and enough disrepair to make any craftsman flinch. Marcus explained the vision: a 10-week course, twice a week, small groups, informal instruction. "Just teach them how to care about what their hands are doing," he said. "The rest follows." Richard agreed to start in 2 weeks. When he returned to Bath that evening, the city was quieter than usual. The streets glistened with recent rain, and the bakery lights below his room cast golden patches on the pavement. He climbed the narrow stairs and entered his room to find a letter slipped under the door. The envelope was plain, his name typed. Inside, a postcard. On one side, an image of a snow-covered path winding through a forest. On the back, just 6 words. "I dreamed you came back. Soon." There was no name, no address, but the handwriting was unmistakable. He held in his hands for a long time, unsure if he was angry, hopeful, or simply tired. That night, he didn't write. He didn't need to. He sat by the window, the postcard in his lap, and watched the city breathe. The move happened quietly. Richard packed his suitcase, folded his clothes with methodical precision, and left the flat above the bakery without ceremony. Miriam didn't ask why. She simply handed him a warm loaf wrapped in cloth and said, "You've been good company," before watching him disappear down the street with a single bag and a box of tools under one arm. He had found the cottage through a notice posted in the corner of the antique shop, barely legible under a curling edge of wallpaper. Caretaker's cottage. Short let. Quiet tenants preferred. It sat just outside the town, past a stretch of lichen-covered fences, and winding lanes that smelled of moss and ashwood. The cottage had 2 rooms, a crooked fireplace, and a small porch where the wind often gathered like a guest with nowhere else to be. Richard signed the lease without hesitation. He liked the sound the door made when it closed behind him. Not a click, but a softened thud, like the settling of old thoughts. He spent the first few nights in silence, familiarizing himself with the house's peculiarities. The floor sloped slightly toward the kitchen. One window refused to stay open unless propped with a spoon. The fireplace needed coaxing, its draw temperamental, but once lit, it gave off a dry, honest heat that spread to the floorboards and up into the beams. From the first morning, he began a new routine. He woke at 6, lit the stove, and walked the boundary of the small garden while the kettle boiled. The garden had once been tended. Low stone walls, a rusted trellis, and rows of flower beds now overtaken by weeds that swayed in unison with the wind. He found something soothing in the overgrowth, as though the land had grown tired of order and finally let itself breathe. He set up a makeshift workshop in the cottage's second room. The window there faced east, and each morning the sun crawled slowly across the worn wood of the workbench. He brought in a set of tools, boxes of odd screws and hinges, and a small collection of objects needing attention. A legless chair, a warped table drawer, a violin missing 3 strings. The restoration job still came through Theo's shop, delivered now in Ellie's car every Tuesday and Friday. She stayed long enough for tea, sometimes helped him sort tools, but mostly listened while he talked. And for the first time in years, he found himself talking about things that weren't painful. He spoke about structure, about design, about how every joint, every dovetail, every groove had once been a decision someone made, a story in action. "You think people like furniture?" Ellie asked one afternoon, running her fingers along the smooth edge of a sanded tabletop. "Not like furniture," Richard replied, "but maybe like houses. We build without knowing what storms are coming." She looked at him for a long moment. And when they come, we lose shingles, maybe a few walls. But if the frame holds, he shrugged, we can rebuild. Ellie left that day with a look he couldn't quite name. Gratitude, maybe, or something more difficult. The slow realization that someone else understood what you never said aloud. Richard's cottage began to reflect his new rhythm. A woven mat at the doorway, a set of books arranged along the windowsill, a kettle always warm, and a stack of notebooks now occupying the entire bottom shelf of an old spice rack. He had stopped labeling them. One Thursday, he posted a notice at the local community center. Writing group, weekly. No expectations. Just a table and time. He didn't expect much, perhaps one or two curious passers-by. But by the second week, 5 people showed up. By the fourth, they'd outgrown the small corner of the library he reserved and moved into the upstairs hall of a retired church. The group was eclectic. A widower who wrote poetry about his late wife's perfume. A teenager sketching a graphic novel about foxes that wore shoes. A woman in her 60s compiling a family history through recipes. They wrote in silence and then, if they wished, read aloud. No one was required to explain themselves. Richard didn't read anything the first few weeks. He just listened. But eventually, someone asked, "Don't you write too?" He nodded. "Will you share?" So he did. A short piece. Fiction, or so he claimed, about a man who finds a series of anonymous postcards in a house he's restoring. Each postcard contains a phrase, an unfinished sentence. Over time, the man begins to piece together a conversation, one that mirrors a dialogue he had long ago with someone he'd lost. When he finished reading, no one spoke. Not because it was awkward, but because the silence afterward felt full, like the breath you take before something important. "That's not just writing," the woman with the recipe project said. "That's remembering with style." The story stayed with him after that. He found himself revisiting it, polishing the phrasing, tightening the narrative. It began to grow not in size, but in density. It held more of him than he expected. One night, as the fire burned low and the wind combed to the garden, he opened a drawer where he kept the postcards from Amelia. There were only a few, no return address, no requests, just fragments. "I dreamed you came back. Soon. Do you still keep the keys inside the blue bowl? I wish we'd gone to the train museum that day. I only pretended not to care." He arranged them on the table, one beside the other, then opened a fresh page in the latest notebook. He began to write. Not a letter this time, not a story about a stranger, but the beginning of something that felt like fiction only because the truth of it had never been spoken aloud. In the days that followed, the manuscript grew. He didn't call it that, of course. He still saw it as sketches, scenes, snapshots held together by thread. Ellie read parts of it. When she stopped by, she never offered critique, just observations. "This sounds like something that could help someone," she said once. Richard replied, "Maybe it's just helping me." She placed a hand on the table near the notebook. "Isn't that where it starts?" They said nothing more. The quiet held them like shelter. March approached with slow steps, and though the nights remained cold, the garden began to stir. Buds formed beneath frost. Birds returned to the hedgerows. One morning, Richard found a nest half-built in the corner of the trellis. It was a small thing, scrappy and imperfect, but it was a beginning. On the morning of his 70th birthday, Richard didn't wake to a card under his door or a call from a friend. The cottage, blanketed in a soft layer of mist, seemed to whisper nothing but the groaning of floorboards and the sigh of wind against the eaves. He sat at the kitchen table with a cup of black tea, staring at the empty second chair. No one knew the date. He hadn't told anyone. Not Ellie, not Theo, not even Callum. It had passed in silence the year before, and he had every intention of letting it pass again. But something about turning 70 settled uneasily in his bones. It felt like crossing a river he hadn't meant to wade into. He spent the morning tending the garden, pulling back winter debris to reveal the first signs of daffodils poking through the soil. By noon, he had lit the fire and begun rewriting a chapter of his manuscript. The story was evolving faster than he anticipated, not just structurally, but emotionally. The father in the story, once a passive figure, all memory and melancholy, was beginning to speak more clearly. Richard didn't fight the change. He followed it, letting the character grow bolder, more conflicted, more alive. The manuscript was no longer a simple story. It was a kind of confrontation. He had just finished writing a passage in which the daughter character, unnamed still, always referred only by the father as you, leaves a final postcard with only the words, "I'm done being angry," when his phone buzzed against the table. He looked at it. A message. Unknown number. A photo. He tapped it open. It was a picture of a page from his favorite childhood novel, the same one he had once read to Amelia before bed, night after night, back when she still wanted stories. The photo showed a paragraph highlighted in blue ink. Beneath it, someone had written in careful print, "I cried on this page." There was no name attached to the number, but he knew it was her. He stared at the screen for a long time, the sound of fire crackling behind him, the weight of everything unspoken pressing on his chest. He did not respond. Instead, he went out for a walk, notebook in his coat pocket. The sky had turned a pale silver, the air sharp with the last bite of winter. He walked past the abandoned chapel, through the muddy path near the railway line, and finally up the hill where the town unfurled below in soft beige and green. From there, he dialed into the voicemail system. He hadn't checked it in over a month. The robotic voice greeted him, followed by, "You have 58 unheard messages." He didn't know what shocked him more, the number or the sudden fear that one of them might be the last. He pressed play. The first message was brief. "It's Amelia. I thought you'd at least acknowledge the letter." The second was clipped quieter. "You got the postcard, I think. If you didn't, it doesn't matter." Then came the third. "I had a dream you were standing at the kitchen sink, humming. That used to mean everything was all right. It's stupid, but I woke up crying." The fourth was silence. The fifth was worse. It was her trying to speak and failing. The line cut off just after she breathed in. Richard sat down on the bench, overlooking the valley, and listened to all 58. Some were angry. Some were confused. A few were attempts at normal conversation. Reports about work. Questions he had no context for. Thoughts that meandered before cutting off abruptly. But in every message, even the sharpest ones, there was the unmistakable tone of someone trying to reach through a fog. When the final message ended, Richard didn't delete them. He simply closed his phone and leaned back, the wooden slats of the bench cold against his coat. He pulled out the notebook and wrote one line. "I heard you." The words felt both insufficient and too much. Back at the cottage, a delivery was waiting at the door, a small, square parcel wrapped in brown paper. There was no sender listed. Inside, beneath a layer of tissue paper, was a worn paperback, a field guide to common British birds. A folded piece of notepaper was tucked inside the cover. "You always pointed out robins. I used to pretend not to care. Happy birthday." He ran his fingers along the edge of the cover. The book had water damage. He suspected it had once been his. Perhaps retrieved from a box long thought donated or lost. He opened it to the page on robins. "They mate for life," the caption read, "and defend their territory with remarkable devotion." The next morning, Richard turned on his phone for the first time in weeks. There were no new calls. He placed the phone on the windowsill, where the light hit it just right, as if to remind it wasn't forgotten. The following days passed slowly. The writing group met again, and Richard read another chapter from his manuscript. This one featured a scene in which the father character finally begins responding to the postcards, not by sending any, but by rearranging his home to reflect the words he receives. After the session, the teenager with the graphic novel leaned over and said, "That chapter made me call my mom, just so you know." Richard nodded, but said nothing. His voice was unreliable these days, tight with things he couldn't explain. Later that evening, Ellie visited. She brought fresh bread and a book of short stories she thought he'd like. As they drank tea by the fire, she asked, "Have you thought about sending it out? The manuscript?" She nodded. "It's finished, isn't it?" "Not quite, but it's close. You could use a pseudonym if that's what worries you. But it's good, Richard. People should read it." He looked at the fire. It was never meant for anyone but her. Maybe that's exactly why it should be read. He didn't respond, but later that night, he printed out the first 50 pages and placed them in a folder. He didn't know where he'd send it yet, but for the first time he wanted to. At 2 in the morning, he woke to the sound of his phone vibrating against the window pane. Call number 59. He stared at the screen. He did not answer, but his hand hovered over the device longer this time, and just before the screen dimmed, he whispered into the dark. Soon, the town had begun to thaw. Frost no longer lingered past mid-morning, and the trees near the chapel were touched with green buds that signaled spring's first serious attempt at arrival. Richard stood beneath one of those trees one afternoon, watching a sparrow shift its weight along a low branch, wings twitching like it was unsure whether to stay or go. His manuscript was now complete. The final scene written days ago still echoed in his mind. The father sitting in a railway station with a suitcase in his lap, reading a final postcard that simply said, "I'm already home." The last line Richard had typed felt heavier than all the others. It had not been planned. It had arrived suddenly, without warning, as if pulled from somewhere beneath language. After writing it, he hadn't touched the manuscript again. It lay printed, stacked in a file box beneath his workbench at the cottage, out of sight but not forgotten. Theo had agreed to help him submit it to a small press in London. "Don't expect a parade," Theo had said, squinting through his spectacles. "But they like quiet stories, and yours is the sort of silence that stays in a room." Still, Richard hadn't sent it yet. He spent his days as usual, volunteering, fixing, walking, writing only fragments. Yet a new kind of weight had entered his routine. Not sadness, not even doubt, just the awareness that something unfinished was asking to be acknowledged. One afternoon, while seated at the cafe near the Abbey, Richard overheard a conversation at the next table. A girl, perhaps 12 or 13, sat beside her mother. She was holding a pastry, but not eating it, eyes wet with withheld frustration. "I don't want him to be perfect," the girl whispered. "I just want him to say he tried." Richard froze. The words dropped into him like a stone into a well. He stared at his tea, untouched, and listened as the girl said nothing else. The mother reached over and brushed hair from her daughter's face, and the two sat quietly afterward, sipping cocoa. When they left, Richard remained at the table, staring at the notebook in front of him. He flipped past several unfinished entries, then turned to a fresh page. And this time, instead of another letter or reflection, he began something new, a story. It was fiction, entirely so at first glance, about a father and daughter who never speak directly. They live in different towns, have no contact, and yet, through a strange twist of coincidence, begin communicating through antique postcards found in second-hand bookshops. One writes a message, leaves it tucked inside a book, and the other finds it weeks or months later in a different town. Neither knows how, but the messages always seem to reach the right person. The premise felt whimsical, even absurd, but as Richard wrote, it became clear the absurdity was the point. The postcard were a metaphor, or maybe something more elusive. Each message was short, simple phrases, questions, tiny stories in themselves. "I bought your favorite biscuits today, and they didn't taste the same. Did you notice the streetlight that flickers outside your building? Do you ever hum in empty rooms, or is that just me?" As the story unfolded, Richard realized it wasn't about reconciliation. It wasn't even about regret. It was about the spaces between what people say and what they mean, the unbridgeable but necessary gaps between memory and truth. The two characters never meet, not even at the end, but the postcards change them. Ellie read the first few pages one evening while sitting cross-legged on the floor of the workshop, nibbling on a sandwich. "This isn't sad," she said after a while. "It's hopeful." Richard blinked. "Is it?" "It's like, even if they never say the things out loud, they still matter." He didn't answer, but her interpretation stayed with him. Later that week, Callum asked if Richard could speak at a small event the shelter was organizing, a storytelling night to raise awareness and encourage donations. "Just 5 minutes," Callum said. "You don't even have to talk about yourself." Richard agreed, though he wasn't sure why. On the night of the event, he stood before a group of 20 or so people gathered in the shelter's main hall. The lighting was dim, the chairs mismatched, and the walls still bore traces of last year's holiday decorations. The audience was a mix, a few volunteers, several donors, some of the residents. He cleared his throat. "I want to tell you a story," he began, "about something that isn't quite true and isn't quite false." Then he read a passage from the new piece about the father and daughter. He chose a scene in which the daughter finds a postcard that says, "I remember the last time we were quiet together. It felt like music." When he finished, there was no applause, not right away, just a stillness. A woman in the back dabbed at her eyes with a napkin. Callum gave him a nod. Afterward, as people mingled, an older man approached him. "That story," he said, voice rough from years of smoke or silence. "It made me want to try calling my son again." Richard nodded once. Then it did more than I expected. That night, walking back to the cottage alone, he realized he wasn't writing to escape anymore. He was writing to return. He reached the cottage just after 9 and found another envelope on the doormat, plain, unmarked. Inside was a single strip of card, torn from the edge of a postcard. "I don't want you to be perfect. I just want you to try." He sat down in the chair by the fire, the strip of card in one hand and his phone in the other. He unlocked the screen, scrolled to Amelia's number, and hovered his thumb over the green button. It was a moment, brief, silent, decisive, and he nearly pressed it. But then, as if on cue, the fire cracked sharply behind him and he lowered the phone. Not yet. Instead, he opened his notebook and began another postcard. This one simply read, "I heard you. I'm still here." He didn't know if it would ever reach her, but for now, it was enough to write it. By the first week of April, the manuscript was no longer secret. Richard had spent 2 full evenings preparing it. He printed out the final draft on thick paper, careful to align each page and staple every chapter cleanly. He placed the pages in a brown cardboard folder and slipped it into a recycled padded envelope. On the front, he wrote the name and address of a small independent publisher in London that Theo had vouched for. They published quiet books, Theo had said, the kind you find on bedside tables and never forget. He didn't expect much, but he sealed the envelope and posted it anyway. 2 weeks passed before anything came of it. He continued volunteering at the shelter, revising short pieces with the writing group, and repairing a series of old radios Theo had recently acquired. Ellie noticed a shift in him, not dramatic but evident, a slight lightness in his step, less hesitation in his words. When she asked if he'd sent it, he simply said, "It's out there now." It was a Tuesday morning when the call came. Richard was in the back room of the shop, fitting a new clasp onto a writing desk, when his phone vibrated against the window ledge. He checked the screen. A London number. No name. He answered on the third ring, his voice calm but taut. Richard Bennett speaking. A woman replied, her voice warm and professional. "Mr. Bennett, this is Claire Harper from Cormorant Books. I'm calling about your manuscript. 58 missed calls." He nearly dropped the screwdriver in his hand. "Yes," he managed. "I wanted to say that I read it. Twice. I don't usually do that. And then I passed it on to our editorial director. He read it overnight. We'd like to speak with you about publishing it." Richard sat down slowly on the work stool, his knees uncertain. "I thank you. I wasn't expecting." Claire laughed gently. "No one ever does, especially the ones who should." They spoke for 10 minutes. She explained the process, editorial notes, timeline, distribution, all with clarity and kindness. She asked if he could come to London the following week for a meeting. "We'd like to meet the man behind the story," she said. He agreed. When he hung up, the workshop felt suddenly too small, the walls close and humming. Later that evening, he told Ellie. She beamed. "That's incredible, Richard. It doesn't feel real yet. That's how you know it matters." The following Thursday, he boarded a morning train bound for Paddington. The journey was uneventful, the countryside unfolding like a film he'd seen too many times but still loved. He carried only a leather satchel, inside which he placed a copy of the manuscript, a notebook, and a scarf Amelia had once knitted for him, a tattered gray thing he hadn't worn in years, but which now seemed like armor. He arrived in London just before noon. The city moved differently than Bath, Faster, louder, less forgiving. He navigated the underground with careful steps, then emerged near a narrow street lined with converted warehouses, cafes with chalkboard menus, and small publishing offices tucked between yoga studios and print shops. Cormorant Books occupied the second floor of a red brick building with ivy crawling up the side. The receptionist greeted him with a smile and offered tea. 10 minutes later, Claire Harper appeared, younger than he expected, glasses askew, notebook in hand. "Mr. Bennett," she said, shaking his hand. "It's a pleasure." "Richard is fine." They sat in a conference room lined with bookshelves. The walls bore frame covers from past titles, slim novels, poetry collections, memoirs with haunting titles. Claire placed his manuscript on the table between them. "I won't ask what's true," she said, "but I will say it feels true." He nodded. "That's all I hope for." "What made you write it?" He hesitated. "I wanted to see if a person could speak honestly without expecting to be heard." Claire tapped the manuscript. "Well, you were." They discussed edits, light ones, mostly structural. She praised the use of silence, the way the story never forced reconciliation but still allowed for tenderness. "It's about damage without spectacle," she said. "We need more of that." As they wrapped up, she added, "There's one thing you should know. If you're not comfortable with publicity, we understand, but this book will resonate. People will want to know who you are." He considered that. "I'm not sure I know myself yet." She smiled. "Then let them find you through the pages." After the meeting, Richard walked aimlessly through the city. He passed familiar streets, ones he hadn't seen since Amelia had lived here. He walked by her old office building, the one she had worked at years ago, and paused across the street. From this distance, the glass facade reflected the gray sky, and for a moment, he imagined her silhouette behind one of the windows, head tilted, fingers tapping a keyboard. He didn't go inside. Instead, he entered a cafe nearby and ordered tea. At a corner table, he pulled out his notebook and wrote, "I walked by where you once were. I didn't look for you. I just needed to remember what it meant to stand near the places you chose." On the train home, he sat by the window, watching dusk settle over the hills. When he arrived back at the cottage, the air smelled of rain and wood smoke. The garden had shifted. More color now, tiny blue flowers pressing through the cracks in the stone path. He stepped inside and found an envelope waiting. No name, no return address. Inside, a blank postcard. He flipped it over. A single line was written in the center. "Do you remember the shape of our silences?" He placed it beside the others, then opened his manuscript folder. He added a final note to the dedication page. "For the one who called, even when I didn't answer." The book was released with almost no noise. There were no launch parties, no author signings, no television interviews. Just a quiet entry into the world. First as a small listing on the publisher's website, then in the catalog sent to libraries and independent bookstores across the country. The cover was simple, a gray-blue background with a faint outline of a telephone, receiver resting on its side. The title, 58 Missed Calls, appeared in modest serif type. Beneath it, the author name, R.J. Benton. Richard had chosen a pseudonym without ceremony. His own initials in Benton, a nod to a street he used to walk down every morning in his early 30s. It had meant nothing then. Now it seemed to fit. The first copies arrived by post 2 days before its official release. Claire had included a handwritten note. "It's in the world now. You did something that matters." Richard didn't open the parcel immediately. It sat on the table for hours while he swept the kitchen, res-tacked firewood, and made an unnecessary repair to a door hinge that hadn't squeaked in months. Only after dusk, with the windows dark and the fire lit, did he finally open it. The book felt heavier than he expected. He turned it over in his hands, traced the cover, and flipped to the dedication page. His own words stared back at him. "For the one who called, even when I didn't answer." He read the first page, then the second. He stopped after the fifth, not because he was dissatisfied, but because the words now belonged to someone else. He had lived them. He didn't need to read them again. Word spread slowly. Independent bookstores gave it small displays. A few reviews appeared online, thoughtful, reserved, but deeply personal. One called An Aching Meditation on Unspoken Love. Another said, R.J. Benton writes like someone who has spent a lifetime listening. Richard didn't monitor the reviews. He let Theo and Ellie tell him when something appeared, trusting them to filter what mattered. Then, on a rainy Tuesday morning, he received a message from Amelia. It came not as a call or letter, but as a photo. The image showed a bookshelf, white, well-lit, modern. On the second shelf from the top, nestled between two books on branding strategy and a collection of essays about womanhood, sat 58 missed calls. Her message beneath the photo, I cried on page 137. He stared at the screen for a long time, heart rising, then slowing. He typed a reply twice, deleted it both times. In the end, he sent only one word, thank you. No response came that day, but something shifted. The following afternoon, he walked into the village post office to mail a package, a copy of the book addressed to one of the residents from the shelter who'd recently relocated, and asked to have it read aloud during their last group session. As he waited in line, the clerk behind the counter looked up from her magazine. You're the one who wrote that book, aren't you? She asked. Richard froze. I suppose so. My sister sent me a copy. Said it made her call our dad. I don't know what you wrote exactly, but she's been avoiding him for years. Richard offered a smile that was more tired than modest. Sometimes stories make it easier to talk. Later, as he walked home with empty hands and a mind full of thoughts, he passed a small bookstore near the edge of town. Its window was usually filled with colorful children's books and touristy postcards. But today, a new arrangement had been set up, a display of early spring reads. 5 titles, carefully chosen. In the middle stood his. There was no fanfare, just a simple placard that read, for anyone who's ever wanted to make the call. He stood at the window, unsure whether to go in. He didn't, but he lingered long enough to watch 2 women step inside, one pointing at the display, the other picking up a copy. That night, he received another message from Amelia. This time it was just text. Some parts felt too close, others not at all. But I underlined things. I haven't done that in years. He typed a reply, paused, then deleted it. Instead, he pulled his notebook toward him and wrote something he didn't plan to send. You don't need to tell me which parts are true. I only needed you to read it. The next day, Ellie stopped by the cottage with a box of pastries and a grin that barely fit her face. You're on a podcast, she said before he could say hello. I'm what? A teacher read a passage from your book. It's gone a bit, well, not viral, but noisy. People are quoting it. She pulled out her phone and played the audio. A woman's voice filled the room. I just want him to say he tried. Richard closed his eyes. The line hit differently now. In the weeks that followed, copies of the book began to appear in unexpected places. A message arrived from Clare. A school in Manchester had included a chapter in its creative writing syllabus. A shelter in Bristol requested a few signed editions for their library. A literary blogger from Edinburgh wrote a review titled Grief That Doesn't Apologize. And then the unexpected happened. A second message from Amelia. I read it again, out loud this time. A pause between her texts. It sounded different. He typed only one thing in return. Things do when they echo. A few days later, a small padded envelope arrived at the cottage. Inside was a copy of his own book, creased, marked, and well-read. Post-it notes stuck out from nearly every third page. One paperclip held together 3 pages in the middle. On the inside cover, Amelia had written, Would you sign it? I want to know it's real. He ran his fingers across her handwriting, smaller than he remembered, but unmistakable. He signed the inside with his real name, and added beneath, enough of it was. He sent it back the next morning. It was a Wednesday in late spring when the message came. There was no introduction, no preamble, just a simple line, type with a care that made it feel more handwritten than digital. Will you meet me? Richard sat at the kitchen table, reading it over and over. The kettle had gone cold beside him, untouched. Outside, the garden hummed with the low life of spring. Bees busy along the blossoms, the wind making quiet work through the trellis. He didn't reply straight away. He left the phone on the table, walked to the far end of the garden, and sat on the small bench beneath the newly leaved ash tree. His thoughts were loud in that silence. He ran through possibilities, worst-case scenarios, best-case fantasies, and all the uncomfortable shades in between. But none of it mattered more than the message itself. That evening, he replied, "Where?" 2 hours later, she answered, "Cafe near Victoria Park. Saturday, noon. No expectations." He read it aloud to himself once, then folded the note into his coat pocket, as though to carry its weight closer to the body. Saturday arrived slowly. He dressed carefully, not to impress, but to feel steady. A clean shirt, the gray scarf, the same notebook always in his pocket. He took the train early, arriving in Bath with time to spare. The cafe she'd mentioned was tucked behind a florist stall, just a small space with white-painted chairs and windows fogged lightly by steam from the kitchen. The kind of place that held conversations gently. She was already there. He saw her through the glass, seated at a corner table, head bowed slightly, a copy of the book open in front of her, dog-eared and surrounded by small colored tabs. She looked different. Not older, though she was. Not colder, though she could have been. Just changed, like someone who'd grown into a shape she'd been resisting for years. He stepped inside. She looked up, and for a moment, neither of them moved. It was not a cinematic reunion. No embrace, no sudden tears, just an acknowledgement, a mutual acceptance that they were at last occupying the same moment. He reached the table. "Amelia!" She gestured to the seat across from her. "Hi, Dad." The word nearly unseated him. It hadn't passed her lips in over a decade. He sat. Silence came next, but it wasn't sharp. It was thick, full of breaths and the rearrangement of old emotions. The waitress came and went, leaving tea and a small plate of scones between them. Neither touched it. Amelia placed the book on the table, her hand resting lightly on the cover. Some of this wasn't true. I know, but it felt true. I hoped it might. She opened it to one of the marked pages, pointing. This line, "I stopped being angry the moment you stopped calling me Dad." Did that really happen? Richard looked at her. Not in those words. But yes, that's when the silence became something else. "I thought you didn't care. You never called. Not after Mom died. Not when I moved. Not when I sent the last card." "I was afraid," he said. "Afraid." "You didn't want to hear from me. That calling would make it worse." She nodded slowly. "It did for a while. And then, I forgot what your voice sounded like," she said. "And I hated that more than anything." The scones remained untouched. She flipped to another page, one marked with 2 tabs. "The postcards, they weren't real, were they?" "No, but you wanted them to be." Desperately. She sat back, exhaling. "You made me cry 3 times. Page 74, 137, and the end." He smiled faintly. "I only cried once while writing it." "Which part?" "The chapter where the father walks past her office and doesn't go in." She tilted her head. "Why?" "Because I did that, not just in the story." Amelia blinked once. Then again, "I saw you that day," she whispered. "I wasn't sure, but something in me knew. You looked like someone remembering a version of me I didn't want to be anymore." He nodded. I almost ran after you." "You didn't." She smiled, just barely. "You walked too fast." He reached into his coat and took out the notebook, setting it gently on the table. "There's more," he said. "Things I didn't put in the book. Things I wrote for me. For you. Not polished. Not publishable. Just honest." She didn't touch it. Not yet. Instead, she leaned forward. "I wanted to be angry longer. It was easier. Safer. I know. But I read your words. And they didn't ask me to forgive. They just waited." "That's what I've been doing," he said. They sat in quiet again. This time it was warm, the kind of silence that lets words settle into meaning. She reached into her bag and pulled out a photo. It was of them years ago, a candid shot he didn't even remember being taken. He was reading something, probably a storybook, and she was curled beside him, half asleep, one arm flung across his lap. The background was blurred. The moment wasn't. "I found this among Mum's old albums," she said. "I don't remember this day, but it looks like we were happy." "We were," he said. "That version of us was." She didn't speak, just nodded, her thumb brushing the corner of the photograph. Eventually, she reached for the notebook. "Can I take this?" "It's yours." She stood. "Walk with me?" He stood too. They left the cafe side by side, steps in sync though they hadn't planned it. They walked through Victoria Park, beneath blooming trees and the quiet drift of petals on the path. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. At one point, she stopped, turned to him. "There's still a lot we haven't said." "I know, and we might never say all of it. I don't expect us to, but I want to say one thing now." "Go on." "I'd like to come for Christmas," she said. "If that's okay." His throat tightened. "I was hoping you'd ask," he replied. The cottage looked different that December. Not drastically, no renovations, no fresh paint, no new furniture, but it carried a different kind of stillness. Not the hollow silence of absence, but quieter hum beneath the walls. A readiness, as though the rooms had been waiting for someone to return, not just Richard, but something older than memory. He had cleared the second room of the tools and sandpaper, tucked the workbench into the shed, and opened the window to air it out. It was to be a guest room again for the first time in years. On the dresser, he placed a folded blanket and a photo frame he hadn't touched in over a decade. The three of them, huddled in front of a Christmas tree that now existed only in boxes or fragments. It wasn't the same tree this year. He had gone to town and chosen a smaller one, a modest pine barely taller than himself, but full and dignified. He decorated it with restraint. A few baubles, a single string of lights, and near the top, the small wooden snowflake Amelia had made in school when she was 7. He found it tucked in an envelope between 2 cookbooks, still faintly dusted with silver glitter and bearing the awkward scrawl of her handwriting. "To Dad, love always." He placed it near the top, not as a symbol, but as a memory, one she could see and choose how to feel about. He had not heard from her again since the cafe. Not directly. She had sent a brief message confirming the date. December 24th, afternoon. No follow-up, no questions, no further promises. But that was enough. He spent the morning cleaning. Not obsessively, just enough to feel the house was offering its best version of itself. He washed the curtains, lit the fireplace, and made her bed with the same care he remembered his mother once applying to holiday guests. He didn't know if she'd stay. He didn't even know if she'd walk through the door, but he believed she might. The hours passed slowly, each one folding into the next like a page too carefully turned. At 1 o'clock, he set the kettle. By 2, he prepared a tray of cheese and crackers, remembering vaguely that she never liked mince pies. At 3, he stepped outside into the cold and walked to the gate, not to wait, but simply to breathe. The wind had the edge of frost, and the garden stood still beneath it. He returned inside at 3:30, poured himself a cup of tea, and sat by the window, watching the quiet road that curved around the hill and disappeared into trees. By 4 o'clock, his hands had begun to tremble slightly. At 4:15, the phone rang. He didn't rush to it. He stood, walked over, and picked it up as though the moment required steadiness. The screen read, "Amelia, call number 59. He answered. A pause. Then, "I'm on the train. Delayed. Signal spotty. But I'm still coming." He smiled, though she couldn't see it. "Good. Sorry, I should have texted. I'm glad you called." A silence, short but sacred. "I'll be there in about 45 minutes, she said. "I'll keep the fire going." He hung up. The call had lasted just under a minute, but it resounded in the room like a bell. Not loud, not sharp, just undeniable. He moved through the house with calm precision now, set 2 cups on the table, pulled out the blanket from the basket beside the armchair, lit the small candle in the window. He hadn't lit that candle in years. It was something Margaret used to do, an old tradition from her family, meant to signal that the door was open, the house ready. the waiting willing. At 5, headlights appeared on the lane. A car service. Not the one he used, but one he recognized from the village. The driver stepped out, opened the back door, and retrieved a single suitcase. Amelia followed. She was wearing a navy coat, buttoned high, and a red scarf he didn't recognize. Her hair was pulled back, and in her arms she held a book, not his, but something dog-eared and thick. She looked toward the house before approaching. No smile yet, just determination. He stepped outside and walked to meet her halfway down the garden path. Neither of them spoke immediately. The car pulled away behind her, wheels crunching lightly on gravel. "I wasn't sure this would feel like the right house," she said. "It hasn't for a long time," he replied. "Until now." They stood in the cold for a beat longer. "May I come in?" she asked. "Of course." He held the door for her. Inside, the warmth met them gently. The fire had caught fully now, burning low and steady. She removed her coat and placed her bag near the stairs without being asked. She wandered the room with slow, careful steps, pausing once by the bookshelf, once by the tree. When she saw the snowflake ornament, her mouth opened slightly. She touched it without removing it. "I can't believe you kept this." "I never stopped." She turned, eyes shining, though no tears fell. "I almost didn't come," she said. "I would have understood. But I'm glad I did." "So am I." He poured the tea. They sat at the table, facing each other. The steam curled between them like a bridge, slowly forming. She opened the book she carried and set it beside her. A different novel, a story he didn't know. "I brought one for us," she said. "Something new." He nodded, already understanding. "You'll read?" "If you like." "I would." She opened the first page and began. Her voice, though quieter than he remembered, still held its natural rhythm. She read slowly, clearly, letting the cadence fill the room. Richard listened, not just to the words, but to the space between them. He watched her eyes move across the lines, her hand resting on the table, her posture slowly softening with each paragraph. It was not perfect. Nothing was, but it was happening. They were sitting, reading together later that evening. As the fire dimmed and the house settled into the hush of night, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small box. She handed it to him without comment. He opened it. Inside was a snow globe, the same one he had thought lost or given away. A tiny house, glitter suspended in oil, 2 figures under an archway. He looked up at her. "You took it." "I found it on the garden wall. Years ago. I came back, even after I said I wouldn't. I was angry, but I saw it there. I thought maybe you left it for me." He turned the globe once. The snow stirred, then slowly settled. "I did," he said. She placed her hand over his. Neither of them spoke. Outside, frost was forming again on the hedges. But inside the house, the warmth lingered. The lights were dim. The tea had gone cold. And the silence, the long, shared silence, was no longer heavy. It was shared, together, at last, at a quiet table for 2.